My name is Ophelia Hukini, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the Director of Communications at Reconciling Ministries Network, and I'm so glad that you all chose to join us this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, for what I think is going to be a fantastic talk with Reverend Charlie Baber. I think that you all are going to really enjoy this for a number of reasons. First, because the content is fantastic. Second, because Charlie has put so much thought into this work of art and creativity and love that he has created. And I also think that something about this work just really strikes a lot of chords with us. It is a pretty transformational way, I think, to talk about a matter of queer and trans justice that is very near to our hearts. Um, I know that we do a lot of like icebreakers on Zoom. And probably you all are used to like naming where you are located or where you go to church, etc. Today, I would love for you all, if this is relevant to you, to put in the chat um, either a comic strip that you have loved or the first comic you can ever remember reading. Um, for me, it was probably a toss-up between Peanuts and uh, Mutts and Calvin and Hobbes. All were actually really pivotal for my childhood development. I just loved them. Ah, Blondie. Yes, Bloom County, Calvin and Hobbes, absolutely life-changing. Yep. I actually heard that Bill Watterson like came out of retirement recently to do some different work from his usual comics. Anyway, I don't mean to get too off track. This is why Emily is usually here doing these instead of me, but Emily is on parental leave right now. Um, I yeah, I think that this is gonna knock your socks off. Um, I am delighted to be joined by Reverend Charlie Baber. And I will let Charlie talk a little bit about himself and Incompatible and the process that went into the creation of this book. But you might know Charlie already from his work with Wesley Brothers Comics. Yes, I see some nods and some smiles in the audience. So you have, Charlie, already given us such a huge gift in that creation. And yeah, I would love for you to talk about you and what brought you to the creation of Incompatible.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me just fine? Yeah, great. Well, my name's Charlie Baber, and I am coming to you live from my childhood bedroom in Cartersville, Virginia. We're visiting my family this weekend, and my mom is on the call. She's downstairs, and that's my husband, Tim, with her, Debbie and Tim over, well, in my right corner. Um, but I am a United Methodist deacon. I was ordained in 2013 in the Virginia Annual Conference, which was where I was raised, and have entirely served my career in youth ministry in the North Carolina Conference. I'm currently the youth pastor at University United Methodist Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and this past year makes 20 years in full-time youth ministry. And I love it. I'm going to keep doing it till they are done with me. Um, but uh, a little while ago, I came out as an older middle-aged adult and had already been through the ordination process, and coming out as someone already serving ordained in the southeastern jurisdiction is kind of, who knows what's going to happen. Um, but it wasn't really until Tim proposed to me that I thought I probably need to do something about where my ordination is kept, because the Virginia conference was not a safe place for me at the time. And so I used a process to transfer my membership to the Oregon Idaho Conference, which is now where I belong. I never thought I would have a connection to Boise, Idaho, but that church there, Hillview, has been incredibly supportive of my family and my ministry. And so when I'm not a full-time youth minister, I am volunteering at the LGBTQ Center of Durham, and I am the author and illustrator of Wesley Bros Comics, and often parenting two wonderful kids who are downstairs watching silly videos right now. And I'm always playing nerdy board games and watching cooking shows. So that's me in a nutshell. I started Wesley Bros Comics about a little over 10 years ago as a way to help me process my own experiences with the ordination process. At the time, I was wrestling with being closeted and being a United Methodist pastor and not really sure how to process that. And comics, drawing and kind of satirizing things was, for me, the best way for me to process. I was very surprised that anybody started reading them. But if you followed the comic, a couple of years ago, Abingdon actually published Submitting to Be More Vile, which was a collection of Wesley Bros comics, which was also something I never thought would happen. And then just this past July, Cascade Books published Incompatible, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So Incompatible kind of existed within the Wesley Bros comics universe. And just a quick rundown of the book itself. It's meant to be a highly accessible mini graphic novel. It's about 80 pages, and it's a story told in 3 parts. The first section is the history of the 1972 General Conference, where United Methodism designated homosexuality as incompatible with Christian teaching. The second part of the story is a broader history of kind of Christian teaching, but also Western psychological beliefs around sexuality and specifically homosexuality. And then the third part of the book is Wesleyan theology, exploring what full inclusion of queer people could look like in the church. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to share my screen and talk to you a little bit more about the book. This is requiring me to do like multitasking. Share screen. All right, here we go. Can you see that? All right, so Wesley Bros, and especially this book, Incompatible, has always been designed to combine history and theology and humor within the comic format. I grew up absolutely addicted to Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield and The Far Side and Doonesbury and Bloom County and Outland, and just always reading the funny papers, and really saw that as my something I wanted to do when I grew up. But the call to ministry was stronger, and that was the pursuit I took for a career. So with the book Incompatible, I realized that when General Conference got pushed again to 2024, I don't know if you guys remember that announcement being made. Within 24 hours of that announcement being made, the Global Methodist Church announced their launch. And I started to, I think a lot of us started to see the writing on the wall for the United Methodist denomination and the disaffiliations that were about to start. But I started to have some concerns that maybe just because the denomination was changing, what if the language of incompatibility didn't just disappear just magically because a bunch of churches disaffiliated? And so I thought that maybe I'm no politician, and I'd never been gifted at the politics of conference setting stuff. But I thought maybe Wesley Bros as a platform could be the place where I tell the story of kind of how I see through research how the church got to where it is today, and through theological research, a vision that I wish we could share together moving forward. So this series started as I called it a history of incompatibility, and I really intentioned only to write about the 1972 General Conference, um, putting out a couple of pages a week. Um, and so I'm trying to move my space bar forward. There we go. All right, so it comes in the context of two parishioners in a church where, I mean, my character, John Wesley, is their pastor, but he's an affirming pastor in this story. And he, he, they want to ask him questions about why basically gay people think that the church hates them if all they're doing is living up to biblical interpretation of these issues. And I wanted to put it in those terms because a lot of people have a false understanding that the only people in the church who are anti-LGBT are the oldest generations. The truth is, there's plenty of young people being swept up in evangelical culture, and who don't understand how affirmation can belong with a biblical interpretation that they've been handed. So I wanted to kind of flip the script on who was asking the question in my story. And then the first act of the story, it goes through. Oh, I have to click my screen to make things move. Sorry, I'm sitting here and it's like beeping in my ear that I'm doing everything wrong. So I began in Wesley Brothers fashion. Everything has to tie back into history because I think it's very important that we understand the actual people who went before us, and the things that they've been through, the decisions they made, give us all of which are shaped by their cultural context and their time. And so I started telling this story in the 1972 General Conference, which was happening during the Vietnam War and growing rights for African Americans and women. And at the time, an increasing awareness of homosexuality and the existence of homosexuals in America. And I'm intentionally using that word for now because of the place in history where we're talking. More about that later. So this portion of the story that I was telling here came directly from the very, very boring 1972 General Conference journal. So a lot of it is just direct quotes, and then put together from research of a couple of also very boring research papers, because I thought, nobody wants to read these things, but they would read it if it was a comic book. So thank you for bearing with my PowerPoint skills. The second act of the story looks at Christian history more broadly, from Augustine to Jerry Falwell, exploring the progression from a tradition that views all sexual pleasure as evil. As you see in that picture to the top left, Augustine is kind of the first person to introduce the idea that sperm itself biologically transfers sin from one person to the next. And then I kind of made the joke that for Aquinas, who's up there in the tree with the binoculars trying to keep a watchful eye on everybody to make sure they're not having sex for pleasure, that the idea for Augustine was that, for Aquinas, was that any non-procreative pleasure, sex for pleasure, he used the word sodomy would be used to describe that for anyone. And so they didn't have any concept of menopause or that women couldn't get pregnant after a certain age. So part of the joke in the storytelling here is that these old couples who supposedly weren't supposed to keep living in the Middle Ages because they should have died of the plague by then, are not supposed to be having sex anymore. The story continues through history as we see kind of religion give way to science, and science still continued along with a lot of the biases that had existed before. So It went from considering homosexuality as a sin to considering it a mental illness. And in the pursuit to make a perfect society, part of that was getting rid of anybody who had same-sex tendencies. And so there were a lot of questions in early psychology about whether homosexuality was a disease that needed to be cured or something that developed like a nature versus nurture sort of thing. And then in the last century, I'm sure you guys have started following the 1946 documentary that's been people have been working on. I think is finally out, but the NRSVs or the RSV first translated the word and homosexuals was introduced into the English translations of the Bible, and it's never left. It's even after I guess 30 years when that same group of interpreters realized the damage they'd done by using that word uh, and changed it back to sexual perverts. So many the damage had already been done in our society, associating biblical interpretations against homosexuality as an orientation itself. So this is kind of the thrust of the middle part of the story, just how our society continued to vilify queer people. And that leads up to the social principles being introduced in the 1972 General Conference. And I was very shocked when I first learned that our church didn't just show up to a conference and say, hey, we're going to really make life hard for queer people. It was actually a reaction to a very thoughtful document that had spelled out protections for queer people, that had originally referred to all sexual people as people of sacred worth, and that homosexual citizens of America were in danger, and the church should maybe think about helping them or protecting them. And I think just because that word itself was introduced in a general conference when nobody was expecting it, there was just a lot of reactionary dialogue. And the phrase was introduced by Don Hand, a man from Texas, who only a year before had been a layperson who witnessed the Gay Liberation Front interrupt the Texas annual conference in protest of the removal of Jean Leggett, who was an out ordained gay minister. And so Don Hand had been instrumental in kind of kicking out some of these rowdy Gay Liberation Front people. And so Texas Conference sent him to General Conference, and then he was the guy that introduced this special language. And in his own words, he felt, and I quote, that the strange sensation that the words were not mine. So he genuinely believed that the Holy Spirit was inspiring him to introduce this language into our book of discipline. The final stages of my story move into much more artistic interpretation of our theology as Wesleyan Christians. So this part really dives into what happens to us at baptism, what happens to us as we claim the love that Christ has for us, what happens to us as we continue to return to the communion table. And so rather than refuting the so-called clobber passages, like there's a million books out there where people just one for one take the verses that are anti-gay and come up with usually very good reinterpretations. But honestly, people who are very anti-gay are not going to be convinced by these arguments. And so there's no need for me to rehash that. So instead, I took a page out of John Wesley's style of arguing theologically. And I learned from Thoughts Upon Slavery, which was an abolitionist tract that John Wesley wrote against Christians who were using the Bible to support slavery. And he never once quoted or refuted any of the passages that they were using to uphold slavery. Instead, he insisted on the larger scope and tenor of Scripture and God's love and God's grace. He insisted on the full humanity of all people made in God's image. He insisted on the fallenness of all humanity, that all are sinful and in need of God's grace. And he insisted on the universality of Christ's work for us, and the invitation is for all. And so this third act really leans on that form of storytelling. And so I used a lot of imagery to convey bigger concepts. So the pastor talking to these kids, and the kids themselves are riding on big fiery seraph wings through the universe, which I was kind of inspired by A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, just the way that she told stories that had a bigger, harder to grasp mystery to them. I used the image of infinity sign that's turned into DNA to portray the universal Christ. And you can see here it's kind of the temple veil is being torn, and there's just this blurring between mystery and the physical world. And so a lot of this middle section, or this final section here, is really insisting on the grace that we claim that Christ offers for us as Christians is bigger than the rules that we put in place that would keep us out. Otherwise, what's the whole point of the veil being torn and quite frankly, the queerness of God becoming human? So the final page of the book has these baptismal waters pouring into Christ on the cross, and then spilling out into the Pentecostal flames on literally every single character that's represented in this book. People who are very opposing to one another, but all still Christians in one way or another. And I wanted to kind of conclude with the cross really destroying this little red thread of incompatibility that goes through the whole book. So a lot of this theological third act is meant to show that queer people in the church are already bearing witness to the love of Christ for us, and are flourishing as out people, and that the church would do well to actually trust and listen to the witness of all of its people. So that's maybe it didn't feel quick, but that's a very quick rundown of the work I try to do in the book. And I think Ophelia may have some directed questions next.
I do. Yes. Thank you so much, Charlie. I really enjoyed the way that you took us through the three acts of the book and your thinking behind a lot of the work that went into it. You had mentioned some of the comics earlier on that had inspired you. You talked about Calvin and Hobbes and Doonesbury and Bloom County and Garfield. Can you tell us a little about an early experience of yours where you learned that art and language had power?
Sure. So I started reading Calvin and Hobbes in the second grade, and it was, in many ways, it was my introduction to a lot of bigger words, because that little 6-year-old in that comic had quite the vocabulary. But it was very silly comic, but there was a story arc where Calvin and Hobbes found a dying raccoon in the woods, and they try to rescue it and take it home, and their mom tries to help them save the raccoon, and they can't, and the raccoon dies. I'm sitting there as this little kid watching, reading day by day as they're coming out. What to me was a very imaginative and fun world, dealing with something very painful, and for me as a child, something that I was afraid of but didn't know how to put words around. And so you had sent me this question, and I was trying to think what is my earliest memory of art and language evoking something bigger in me. And I think that that particular story is it. I do also. I've been drawing since I was a little kid. My mom can attest that when she took me to kindergarten, I had drawn all over my school application and kind of got in trouble for that. I always got in trouble for drawing on my schoolwork. But for me, in elementary and middle school, uh, the using comics to draw pictures and give conversation and tell story that way was the way my imagination made sense of the world, and I think helped to empower me to, I guess, grow into the individual I am today.
Mm, thank you. Thanks, Calvin and Hobbes. It seems like folks in the chat are also saying that it was one of the many um, comics that made such a huge difference in our lives. And I would say for
Hmm.
me too. I also remember Charles Schultz's final letter at the end of the run of Peanuts. And I think I still have that in newspaper form. But it was such a moving goodbye and note of gratitude to readers who were very young, some of them, who followed him on this journey through his life. Anyway, I don't mean to hijack your question. Sorry. Just
No, I still have the newspaper clip of that announcement tucked away
okay.
in a Calvin and Hobbes book from, I think, 1995. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. It just wanted to say how resonant it is that these are life-changing pieces of work um, for young people who also have really vibrant faith lives and huge questions. Um, there is so much that Incompatible accomplishes. Those of you in the room who have already read it can attest to that too. So you said it's a work of history and theology. That's absolutely right. And but you also noted that you didn't want this to be like a point for point refutation of the clobber passages, which I 100% respect. You're right. There are so many works that do that masterfully. And you also mentioned that um, that may not be what changes the mind of somebody who is set against queer and trans affirmation. So, in light of all that, what has been your hope for Incompatible and for its readers?
Or I think, honestly, my first hope is for a fully affirming and inclusive Methodism, but even more broadly, just Christianity,
Mhm.
uh, but also fully inclusive and affirming because of how we cling to this Christ we claim to believe in. And so, for my part, I want this book and the imagery and I guess the way that I tell stories, which sometimes I accept may feel a little all over the place, but at least that's what my editor said. Um, I hope that the way this story is told maybe offers a platform for better conversations in churches and between individuals who are so used to just very black and white conversations or very antagonistic conversations. Part of what I was hoping with this was that, and I think I've seen this working in some churches, is it challenges people to look beyond just I think a lot of people are non-affirming because they have no idea what they're not affirming, and they they just have an idea of what they think is wrong and are either are not interested or have not heard someone offer them what actually I think we're talking about when we talk about being affirming and inclusive. Um, So I will say the bishop I serve in North Carolina uh, read my book and sent me the most beautiful message about it. And then she required all of her district superintendents and cabinet to read my book. And so that's something I would have really hoped for, but never thought would happen. So it was very cool that that's happened. And I hope theologically for people in those capacities, it gives them better language for talking theologically and pastorally with people.
Yeah, I think it accomplishes all of that and more. Thank you. I'm struck by the graciousness with which you talk about um like the book becoming a vessel for people to have less antagonistic conversations about affirmation, and then what you said about how like sometimes people just have no idea what they're not affirming of. It just strikes me that like that is a very grace-filled um posture. The the third section of your book is particularly moving to me, that like depiction of the divine, the image of the cross destroying the red thread of incompatibility. Like um, I'm very moved by these depictions. And originally, I had wanted to ask you about whether the creation of the comic was a spiritual endeavor for you, and that in hindsight is a silly question. Obviously, it is. So I guess I'm just wondering then if there's anything else you wanted to say about that, like how the artistic creation and process, and then the spiritual nature. Like this is your ministry in some respect. I mean, you are
Yeah.
also a youth minister, but like this is an active ministry. So yeah, I was wondering if you wanted to say anything else about that.
Yeah, sure. Any of you who are out there who have to preach regularly, I thankfully only preach like once every 3 to 4 months. But writing a weekly comic that is based within Methodism is feels very much like preparing and preaching a sermon. Um, and so there is often a lot of prayer and research that goes into what I do weekly with Wesley Bros anyway. But with this story particularly, um, it was also very personal because I'm one of the people who's could have very easily lost my ordination very quickly just for coming out, and have had to move, you know, bureaucratically my credentials so that that wouldn't happen. And just knowing how hard it is for people like me who come out before they go through the process, that just adds a layer that um, is very difficult. So for me, a lot of this was trying to tell a story without being reactionary myself, without um, elevating my the purpose of what I was doing to a level of anger or I'm here to refute so and so. It was really just I wanted to try and I mean, at my heart, I'm still a pastor and who knows what it sounds like to talk pastorally versus what it sounds like to talk like I need you to shut up and listen to me. And so I was trying to always tell this story from a pastoral heart, and that absolutely requires a tremendous amount of prayer and self reflection in the process of creating it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It um your work is very much infused with thoughtfulness, and I would say you definitely accomplished that, like, not wanting to elevate your self or make this about indignation, but rather where the spirit's leading you to speak. Um, on that note, what do you think that you can accomplish as a storyteller with a medium like a graphic novel or a comic book or a periodic, um, like an ongoing comic strip, that you can't with merely like a written format, like a book or a blog?
Sure. Well, so originally when this story was being written, it was essentially being published serially. So every week people would get the next 4 pages of the story. So part of the telling of the story was creating tiny little cliffhangers every week that would bring you just to the point of, oh, we're going to get somewhere. And then, oh, I have to wait. Remember when TV used to make you wait for a week or a whole summer before the next thing? So just the serial publication of it was part of the medium originally. And now that it's in book form, um, I could not have I could not have written this as just a book. My skill set is not there. Um, and I will read one normal book to every 25 graphic novels that I read. So for me, it was a medium that just made sense for storytelling. But I think what's interesting is a lot of people who are reading this right now are not people who've ever read a comic book or a graphic novel before, and were a little hesitant to try, particularly some of the older Sunday school classes in my church, or some of the United Methodist women groups in my church, but they still did it. And what they've told me, which was what I would have hoped anyway, was the nature of the images as part of storytelling. Um, it triggers a different part of your brain, and I think studies show that particularly for historical subject matter, and I think in this case, theological subject matter as well. When you attach it to visual storytelling, people get it faster and they empathize with it faster. Um, and that, I think that's just part of the medium of the graphic novel.
That's so cool. It makes me wish now that all of my high school history books were graphic novels. Perhaps I would have remembered some of that a little better than I ended up. Um, this is a question that I wonder if you dislike people asking, but I kind of feel like the audience may want to know, and I want to know. Is there another artistic project that you would like to take on after this one? Knowing that Wesley Bros still is um, alive and well, do you have any ideas, or do you think that you're going to let Incompatible kind of live out there for a while?
Um, well, I'm definitely going to let it live out there at least through General Conference 2024.
Yep.
um, and probably if there's something next after that, start thinking about that then. I will say, last summer I did a one-off comic that was just a Father Gregory Boyle quote.
Hmm.
He is a priest at Homeboy Industries, which is the largest um, gang ministry in the United States and most successful. And his Homeboy Industries Facebook page reshared my comic. And I was like, okay, it'd be really cool if they liked it me enough that they would want me to like interpret one of his books into a comic book form. But I'm gonna have to need some connections for that. But I a while back started a story that I would love to write and illustrate that is not overtly religious, but much more rooted in some of my childhood imaginations around uh, the beauty and scariness of growing up out in the country and being a kid in the wilderness. And I mean, I grew up in a house. I didn't grow up in the woods. Don't worry. But um,
Your mom
can
is
I
here.
just yeah, hi mom. Can I just tell y'all that when I tell people that I grew up in the country and now I live in like a college town, somebody was like, I met your mom and she's not a country bumpkin. She's very cosmopolitan. I was like, yes, I know. My mom is so horrified that I just shared that with you. But anyway, I would love to keep telling stories, and I would either love tattoos on the heart. Somebody put that in the comments. But yeah, I would love to do something that somebody else wrote if they would have me illustrate it, or if I was writing it and illustrating it, maybe something that wasn't overtly Methodist and hyper religious like pretty much everything I do.
Yeah, that would be such a cool break. And as you were describing the project that you were thinking about undertaking, I thought that sounds really exciting. I think a lot of us former or current Calvin and Hobbes fans would be a big fan of that. Um, I'm just reading a comment from someone in the chat. Lynn said, I gave my loves history, hates reading, autistic grandson an action Bible for Christmas, which is a graphic novel Bible.
Mhm.
Brilliant. Actually, that sounds like it'd be a really great resource for a lot of us. Um, Pam asked, is there a study guide to use with Incompatible? And that is Flo mentioned in the back of the book. Um,
Yeah, the back of the book has like definitions of terms used in the book. It's got tons of resources that are accessible at different levels and kind of tells you like if you're a beginner or if you've been thinking about this for a long time. And then because I wanted this to not just come across as a fluff piece, there's like research paper level end notes at the end, which took me like 4 months to put together. And that was the most boring part of making this book. And then, yes, there's a study guide that I actually had uh, like 6 or 8 other queer pastors kind of in the background help navigate how those questions would come across and how they might work in different kinds of congregations. So there's a lot of thought into the ability to use this book to have meaningful discussions with people.
Great, thanks. Along those lines, when you're talking about having folks engage at different levels, um, another question came in from Valerie, who asks, how young of a reader would be able to benefit from Incompatible?
Sure. Um, middle school is probably appropriate. I think any younger, and you're going to have to prepare yourself for the fact that the word sodomy is used a couple times in here, and they might have questions about what that word means. And if you don't have problems with answering that question, and then they're horrified that their mom or grandmother answered that question. um, it's very frank about the topic, but it's not. I would say it's a PG book, rated T for teen.
All right, thanks. Pretty descriptive. Yeah, rated T for teen. Yep. Um, a few other questions from folks. Joanna asked, was it hard to grow up gay in the country?
Great question. Well, it was also the 90s, so I didn't know gay people really existed, which is funny because my lifelong best friend, we were both like, oh, if we'd had only known back then, this wouldn't have been so hard. But it's funny. Now I'm out, and here I am in rural Virginia, where I got married, and I went to the clerk of court here got a certificate, and they celebrated me. And my parents' neighbors have celebrated me. And it's funny, I think a lot of folks assume that uh, we make a lot of assumptions about all the different segments of Americans. And I know this is a very American centric conversation, but um, I try to constantly remind the folks in the college town and the city where I work that just because a person's from the country doesn't mean that they're going to treat you poorly. Or I mean, there's plenty of places where people aren't safe, that's for sure, but I do not feel that way here.
Yeah.
Does that answer that
But
question? I mean, I didn't come out of the closet till I was 38, so it the real answer to your question was yes, it was hard growing up gay in the country. Yes. I didn't come out.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Thanks. That's a really nuanced and thoughtful answer. And you touched upon, once again, like not making assumptions about different demographics of people, which I do not think that this question did, but
no,
yeah,
it
you
does. It often surprises people, though.
Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just that you had also said that about age and affirmation too. And lest we forget who were the folks who started the reconciling movement 40 years ago, but like, they weren't
Yeah,
sums. Um, they were ordained people who, um, yeah, have been in the fight for a while.
yeah.
Um, Another question, this one from Mary says, why did you choose ordination in the United Methodist Church, instead of in a denomination that's more liberal and affirming?
I think that's a very fair question. That honestly, when I was going through the ordination process, I was in my late 20s. I was in great denial about my sexuality and very closeted and giving almost no thought or concern to LGBT issues at all. It was not on my radar. I wasn't around people who were talking about those things at the time that I was going through ordination. And I loved the churches I had worked for, and it was a system I grew up in and understood, and so it was just easier to stick with some. I honestly, I told myself any denomination has its own problems, and I feel like I can deal with these problems because I know them. Um, so, and now that I'm here, I could switch to another denomination, but I'm like, after going to the RMN convocation in Charlotte in October and seeing the generations who've been fighting for decades before me, I was like, well, I'm not leaving now. I just joined in. So it helps that I work at an entirely affirming congregation as well. So
Yeah, it is always encouraging to me to hang out with folks who've been fighting this good fight for a long time. And also to see folks who um, are new to the movement too and full of energy and new ideas. Um, Before we get any further, I realize that there are like 10 minutes left or so. I wanted to put in the chat where people can find Incompatible. Um, you can buy it at Cokesbury, and if you're gonna check Amazon, it's the same price as Amazon. So Cokesbury it is. But yep, you can buy it here. Um, and
I
yeah,
will
and
say if you buy it from Cokesbury, they're more likely to want to publish one of my books again. So
thank you. Yep, that is great incentive too. Um, Feel free to, if you have a comment or a question that you want to say with your own voice, I think you all have the capability of unmuting yourselves, so um, feel free to do that. Oh, but before we do that, follow-up question from Natalia. Thinking of why so many of her LGBTQIA students pursuing ordination in the UMC, literally as we speak. She says, does the Wesleyan theology of grace you depict so beautifully in Wesley Bros also make it hard to think of going elsewhere that lacks the bros?
I think that's a great question. There are quite a few denominations that I think are quite similar to us theologically, and it almost feels like the only difference is their politics and how they set up ordination or congregational things. And um, honestly, it's very geeky to love John and Charles Wesley, just like it's very geeky for Lutherans to love Martin Luther or Calvinists to love John Calvin. I don't think I could be Calvinist, but that doesn't mean I don't love them. Uh, so I don't know. I think I meet with some people who are candidates for ministry and LGBTQ right now, and it's very hard for them, especially not knowing what's going to happen with the denomination. And what we kind of all tell each other is, well, we're just going to take it 1 month at a time and follow the Spirit's lead and keep doing what we're called to do where we are right now.
That's a really faithful response. Bree asks, are there other helpful books you would recommend regarding LGBTQ identity and faith?
And faith specifically. I should have an answer to this question. I read a lot of books. So yeah, Queerfully and Wonderfully Made, I think is what it's called. I'm actually just going to open up my book to the resources page because I actually did this research before. Queerfully and Wonderfully Made is a guide for LGBTQ plus Christian teens. And there's a counterpart book called Welcoming and Affirming, which is a guide more for adults in their lives, supporting them and walking beside them. For me, that is like the number one starting place for your question, because it is written for people asking these questions, and it is very accessible. And I love that there's like a youth version and an adult version. And let's see, I also, that's my favorite. I think Queer Theology made a really great devotional book. It's like 40 days of devotions that are from a queer perspective. And the Our Bible app people made a fantastic devotion book called The Deconstructionist's Playbook, which I think is a very misleading name for what the work it actually does, but it's literally just devotions written by queer people, and it's so beautiful. So those are very good for especially queer Christians looking for a way to practice their spirituality without feeling othered, maybe is a good way to say it.
Great. Yeah, thank you all also for putting in the chat your personal recommendations as well. And then I think we've got a list of books on the RMN Resources website too. And yes, underscoring Charlie's point, the list of resources in the back of Incompatible.
Yeah, at least 3 of these people you put on here wrote recommendations for my book. So
Ding, ding, ding.
ding, ding, ding. My husband really wanted me to get Amy Grant to write a recommendation for my book because he thinks that would like make me famous. And I was like, I know someone who knows Amy Grant, but she's not going to write it for this book. Maybe the next one.
The next one, yeah.
Yeah.
Once again, folks, that is the link that I just pasted in the chat to find Incompatible. Ray asks, do you have any advice for young people that have been elected to lead the church into reconciliation and inclusion? Myself, 21, and my co-chair, 27, are finding it discouraging at times. Your book gives me lots of hope, though.
Oh, yes, that is difficult, especially if the local church you're involved in is split on this. I cannot personally imagine the courage it would take to be a queer person and a queer young person at that, trying to lead your church through those conversations. Because it feels like you're just trying to defend your own existence in the community. And so I understand the sense of discouragement, and that's why I think it's really important to make connections with other queer Methodists or other queer people of faith who are trying to do what you're trying to do, because then you don't feel so crazy. I was before I came out, I was serving at a church that was 50-50 on the issue, and I could not handle the questions that were coming my way or the things that people would say to me. And I had to move to a church that was more fully affirming. Thankfully, the church I left eventually became fully affirming. But I personally, at that stage in my life, couldn't be the one leading the charge in that work. I think because I needed some personal work first. So,
Mm. All right. Thank you for your answer to that. And yeah, I would underscore that as well. You doing that work alone must, or with a co-pilot, must feel like a tremendous weight. And if it would be helpful for you to get in touch with other young folks, then let's see if we can get you in touch with other young folks. That's my email address, if that'd be helpful. All right, we've got 4 minutes left, and I want to respect people's time. So if you want to unmute and there are any questions or comments that you would like to share with your own voice, then feel free to do that. Also, go ahead.
I'd be interested to know, is everybody here because we're all part of reconciling ministry?
I imagine that most of the folks here
Or
are.
did people find out about it some other way?
Good question.
Reconciling Ministries Network.
Lynn, how about you? How did you find out about this event?
I don't know. I've been doing this for 25 years. Everybody's got my email address. But my church was the first reconciling ministry church in South Jersey.
Oh, great.
And I was part of Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. Back in the day, I was part of Garden State Equality, working for anti-bullying laws and marriage equality. And then Stephen Goldstein retired from Garden State Equality to go become a rabbinical student, and I retired to go to church and try to explain this to the straight people, like why we have to do this. And the one thing I'm very surprised that I do not hear people say, I'm hearing more about 1972, but I phrase it in a slightly different way. It was the first general conference after Stonewall, after the Stonewall Rebellion. That's when they put that in there. And it just kind of ticks me off when I think about that. That's like, okay, here's people, like, for the first time, they're getting ready to stand up and they're getting ready to be themselves. And the church people are like, no, honey, go right back in that closet you just came out of. That's what it was, as far as I can see.
That is also a really important historical context. Thank you, Lynn.
I can't find the hand raising function, so sorry that I'm just jumping in with what Lynn said. I want to celebrate her long record of advocacy first and foremost, and I was born in Jersey, so woohoo. But I also have read the entire DCA from that horrible day in April 1972 as part of my own research and presentations, as a part of the Scholars for what is now an Inclusive Church. It was a way forward. Remember those days? But it bears reading, if you can stomach it, with full-fledged content warning, because what you do see is exactly the fears that popped up on the floor of General Conference. And it was because people had read a sensationalist story in Life magazine about a criminal. It was about somebody having opinions about the gay bar down the street that was preying on young people on the college campus. It was nothing to do with scripture or Wesleyan orthodoxy or anything else. And so, yeah, while Stonewall doesn't get named, it's very obviously the kind of reactionary and panicking response that you're talking about. And I appreciate your witness to that.
I'd like to ask another question too. How many people are doing a worship service to commemorate World AIDS Day once a year? Because the Book of Resolutions has an awful lot about that. And, I took that to, I came to this Methodist thing from Roman Catholicism, and love the sinner but hate the sin. And I read the Book of Discipline, I read the Book of Resolutions, and I'm like, I took it to my pastor, and I'm like, hey, we're supposed to be doing something here about World AIDS Day. And she was like, huh? So I started doing it. I think it's a very good way to get your church's name out to the public and open your doors. We say, my church, open hearts, open arms, open minds. Yeah, something like that, but open arms. Yep.
Hey, Charlie, I got a fun question for you. Not that these haven't been fun. Jordan Kramer here from North Texas Annual Conference. It's nice to see another comic book fan and a graphic novel fan. Thank you for saying that. As a candidate in the process, I'm curious, what is the latest graphic novel or comic series that you are reading?
Oh, very fun. I'm reading two simultaneously right now because I got them both for Christmas, and they're both queer comic books. One is Paper Girls, which is by the same person who wrote Why the Last Man Standing, and is about a group of kind of queerish girls that deliver the paper on their bicycles in the 80s when an alien invasion happens, and I'm living for it. And I'm also reading a book called Monstrous, which is set in a matriarchal society, and I've yet to actually meet any male characters in two books, but it's fascinating book, also written by two women. So those are the books I'm reading right now.
If you're curious, if you haven't heard of Lumberjanes, that's also a fun one.
It's so good.
Hey, thanks for answering that question for me.
Yes.
All right, folks, this has been, at least for me, fun, enlightening, inspiring, encouraging. Thank you, Charlie, so, so much. Again, folks, if you want to find Incompatible, here is the link where you can order it for yourself, your small group, your church. Thank you all so much for your time, your thoughtfulness, and your questions. We will put up a video version of this, a recording, in the days to come. Folks, your pictures will not be in the video, and I just used first names, but if for whatever reason you don't want me to use your first name, then I can go and edit that out. Just email me, and here's my email address, and I can take that out. Otherwise, we do have a few other events at RMN coming up, and I will put those in the chat in a second. The first is coming up on February 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, or sorry, 4 p.m. Pacific. And that is called Making Connections to Make Change. It's with Chris Pepple from Parents Reconciling Network, and she'll be talking about using your story for LGBTQ advocacy. And then the second is with the RMN organizers. That will be on Tuesday, February 6th at 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific. That's called General Conference is Coming. What can you do? This is a season of a lot of events at RMN, so I'd encourage you to check out our social media pages or our emails when you get them in your inboxes. There's tons to do and tons of ways to get engaged. But anyway, thank you again so much for being here tonight. Thank you, Charlie, for your ministries and for the gift of this book being released out into the world. We're really grateful for you. Good night,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Good night, everybody.